This is your year to ring in the deals and ring in the keys to your brand new ride during our Ring in the Savings event at Capital Ford. Like a new 2025 Ford F-250 Super Duty with 0% APR for 60 months. Or a new 2025 Ford Bronco Sport. Just $495 a month lease for 36 months with no money down. This is your year, so drive into 2026 the right way during our Ring in the Savings event at Capital Ford in Santa Fe.
Hey, what's going on, Lobo Nation? We welcome you to another episode of the Pit Press Live. UNM men's basketball will have a quarterfinal game in the NIT tomorrow, 7 p.m. in the Pit. They will take on St. Joseph's of the Atlantic 10 Conference. I am Nick Nunez, joined by the owner of the Pit Press, Eric Moulton, and our special guest tonight is Riley Frayne. He covers college basketball for Mid-Major Madness. He's also a scout and analyst for the Portal Report. He's coming to us from Philadelphia. Riley, how's it going tonight, man? Thanks for joining us on the Pit Press Live.
Absolutely, guys. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here talking some NIT basketball. Season's coming to a close, but is there a better time of year than March, whether it be for the NCAA tournament, for the NIT? So I'm excited to talk about it all. Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure, guys.
Yeah, man, for sure. And, it's just exciting that our teams are still playing basketball at this time. The NCAA tournament is winded down to the Sweet 16, and you got the crown coming up here in about a week. But other than that, man, it's the NIT, and the Lobos and the Hawks of St. Joseph's, again, will square off tomorrow in the Pit. Riley, we brought you in to talk about St. Joseph's basketball. They were 24-11 on the season, 13-5 in Atlantic 10 conference play. Just give us a general overview of this St. Joseph's team, man.
Sure. It's definitely been a little bit of a unique season, just due to some different circumstances. We had our head coach sort of promoted from an assistant role just kind of a couple of weeks before the season. I'm sure you can imagine some of the adversity that leads to. We were lucky enough to have a lot of the players stay. But some early struggles in the non-conference. And, we had our leading scorer up to that point opt to depart the program sort of in early December. Sort of like mid to late December. And funny enough, it actually spurred sort of an incredible run the rest of the way for the season. So, a team sort of picked in the bottom half of the A-10 coming into the preseason, goes on to finish top 3, in conference in the A-10, grabs a double bye for the conference tournament, and puts together a pretty good season despite sort of, a lot of the things I just mentioned, finishing 24-11. Their best finish since, I believe, 2018 when they got the double bye in A-10 conference tournament as well. Sort of an interesting group. Like I mentioned, they lost their leading scorer earlier, so they've definitely been a little devoid of offense. But they have a couple guys in particular who can really score it well in Jaden Glover Toscano, who transferred over from St. John's in the offseason and has sort of taken on the brunt of the offensive load a little bit later in the season here. But in addition to him, Derek Simpson has really, really turned it on as a senior here. He's been with the program for 2 years, has really taken a leap here, was definitely an all-conference first team selection this season. Behind him, Desir Haskins has really come on strong as he's technically a junior, but a redshirt sophomore in terms of eligibility, and another guy who's sort of stepped up to carry some of the offensive load, after St. Joe's losing some of that scoring. So I talk about the offense, but it's definitely not the most offensive-centric team. Definitely a St. Joe's team that's defensive-based. If you're interested in the KenPom metrics, 56th in the country in adjusted defensive efficiency. A lot of that comes down to their big man on the interior, Justice Ajabo, who led the A-10 in blocks and finished co-conference defensive player of the year. St. Joe's is going to try to funnel a lot of this scoring from New Mexico downhill, because he's going to be able to swat a lot of those shots away, or at least that's what he does particularly well. But Yeah, I think that sort of surmises, the St. Joe's story well. It's been an interesting season, a lot of ups and downs, like I mentioned, a good bit of adversity, but it ended up being one of the best seasons, in recent program history, at least going back to when I was a student, prior to 2021.
We're speaking with Riley Frayne of Mid-Major Madness. Riley, tell us about the turnaround for this St. Joe's team. You mentioned it. I think they started A10 conference play 0-2, and they had maybe midway through that conference season, they had won like 6 games in a row going into the conference tournament, and they're coming off back-to-back wins in the NIT, man. Just kind of tell us how this team has really gelled together down the stretch.
Sure. It's interesting heading into sort of conference play in right before the Christmas break. They had a tough loss to a Coastal Carolina team in the Sun Belt that struggled a little bit this year. They lost on home court, and so I think at that point there was sort of some concern around the program. As you mentioned, they then opened conference play 0-2, and I specifically I think back to a loss against Davidson on home court at Hagan Arena, is the St. Joe's on campus venue. I think back to a loss to Davidson back in early January, I believe January 3rd or 2nd, where they led from the majority of the game, and Davidson sort of pulled away from it late. I remember the Davidson head coach, Matt McKillop, sort of describing it as his team getting his swagger back, and you could feel sort of the air taken out of this St. Joe's program when you were talking to head coach Steve Donahue post-game after that Davidson loss. And the story goes literally the next day, St. Joe's, some of the students, some of the guys I listed earlier in Jaden Glover Toscano and Derek Simpson sort of took to head coach Steve Donahue's office in a player-led meeting and sort of discussed, how this coaching staff could better go about nurturing success, in the wake of the loss of their leading scorer earlier that season. And to shout out a story I did on sort of that player-led meeting, the players sort of described it as a culture-changing moment for the team, and it sort of spurned from that moment. St. Joe's going on to a big overtime win against Duquesne, and things really changing from there, the momentum around the program. From that Davidson loss on, they went on to win 3 straight, the overtime win against Duquesne, as I mentioned, on the road at Richmond, who had been pretty strong in the non-conference up to that point. They win another one against a St. Bonaventure team that's always pretty decent in conference. And then they played a really close game against VCU, who we all just know was pretty strong in the NCAA tournament. So you could see the turnaround kind of from that moment on. For me, it really stemmed from that player-led meeting, the players sort of taking that leadership role upon themselves to go talk to, a head coach who had only been with the program, who had been recently promoted into the role, but had only been with the program really for a couple months up to that point. So that's sort of what it stemmed for me. And, as you mentioned, they went on to finish out, conference play with 6 straight wins heading into the conference tournament, picked up one against Davidson and, a loss against VCU. They didn't really let it spur them in the conference tournament. Again, a VCU team we just watched play in the NCAA tournament and have sort of bounced back well in the NIT here to make a little bit of a run. So yes, to answer your question, Nick, for me, it all sort of goes back to January with the players sort of taking on that leadership role and addressing it. And, it's really led to sort of a real culture change. And you could just feel sort of the chemistry growing from that moment, having been around the team.
Yeah, Riley, I actually read a really cool story just recently, that something Nick sent me this morning, but about the program and what they kind of adopted with Coach Donahue, that culture change, right? I think after that loss that you had mentioned earlier, they all came into practice the very next day, and they all had brand new practice jerseys, but they all carried the number 1 on them, right? Kind of play as collective and just trying to get everyone to buy into this newfound, I guess, identity for the season. And I mean, now coming into the game at the Pit, obviously the Pit has a storied tradition. It's sure. Loud. We expect it to be 9, maybe 10,000 deep. But can you talk about more of the momentum that they've been carrying as of recently, right? They knocked off Cal. They come back from a 19-point deficit on the road, a real back and forth game, but they're winners of their 9 out of their last 10 games. And I think they finished 3rd in the conference season, end up making it all the way to the semifinals and end up losing to the eventual A10 champions in VCU. UNM is familiar with VCU. We actually traveled out there and knocked them off on the road, which is probably the biggest signature win that UNM had this year in a true non-conference game. So, I mean, maybe just talk a little bit more about their recent trajectory, how they've been playing collectively, and maybe some momentum as they head into tomorrow night?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing for me is there's definitely two senior leaders on this team in Derek Simpson and Justice Ajibor, who I've talked about at length. But sort of outside of those two guys, this is a really young and inexperienced team. Jaden Glover Toscano, who I mentioned coming over from St. John's, really did not play much as a freshman there. Desir Haskins, who I spoke about earlier, is really a redshirt sophomore who didn't play a ton as a freshman, and so he's still learning and growing into the game. Austin Williford, who you'll see will play some very impactful minutes and can score the ball really well, is a freshman and was on the A10 All-Conference freshman team. So all around, overall, this is a really, really young group, kind of still learning to win, and you could definitely see that took some time. And I definitely think sort of the momentum they continue to build over the next couple of weeks, over the last few weeks, is going to play into a lot of that. You mentioned it. I mean, coming back from 19 points on the road against Cal is certainly no small feat. Like, for a young team, again, like to my point, they're learning how to win. They're, so sort of the mentality at St. Joe's, our motto is the hawk will never die. And this team, I mean, they really do play with it at times. It feels like they might be, they lost by double digits to VCU. And again, I said it earlier, but they did not let that loss in the A10 tournament discourage them. They understood that's a very good VCU team, and they bounced back and won 2 straight on the road. Both in pretty comeback fashion, if I'm not mistaken, against Colorado State, that being a pretty close game, and, 19 points against Cal, as we mentioned. So again, this is a young team learning how to win. They've sort of carried that momentum. The chemistry has continued to build throughout the year. As I've mentioned, they haven't really let one tough loss or one sort of adverse moment sort of discourage them. I think back to in the middle of conference play, in early February, they had a tough 2-game back-to-back stretch, losing to a George Mason team that was very good in conference play, but then sort of back on the back of that, falling to Fordham at home by double digits. A Fordham team that had a very respectful year in the A10, but still finished bottom half, and really a team that St. Joe should have been beating at home at that point. And again, just to sort of my initial point, they didn't let that discourage them. They then closed out the season, with 6 straight. So momentum's definitely been a big part of it. I think learning to win for a young team has been a big part of it. And, continuing to carry that momentum forward has sort of been, a theme of this team, not letting one little adverse moment sort of discourage them. So, a young team coming into the pit, you guys mentioned it. I mean, I don't know what the KenPom home court advantage metrics are, but I know the pit, one of the toughest mid-major environments to play in the country. Everyone knows it. I think it's definitely going to challenge a young St. Joe's team, but I think they have sort of the chemistry, the connection to, I think they're going to come together and sort of, I don't want to say rally around it, but I think they're up for the challenge. They play with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder going out on the West Coast. So I'm interested to see how a young team sort of handles it. And as you mentioned, Eric, sort of carries the momentum forward of a 19-point comeback win, because that's, again, really substantial.
We're speaking with Riley Frayne of Mid-Major Madness, previewing UNM men's basketball's quarterfinal matchup against St. Joseph's tomorrow night, 7 p.m. in the pit. Riley, let's take a look at St. Joe's KenPom profile. I did a little bit of homework today, listening to some post-game press conferences with Coach Steve Donahue. The thing that stands out to me from St. Joseph's KenPom profile, they're a very good defensive team. Mm-hmm. They are ranked number 56 in defensive adjusted efficiency, number 32 in defensive effective field goal percentage. And those are pretty impressive numbers just there, kind of standing alone, man. Mm-hmm. But what I heard Coach Steve Donahue and some of the players talk about in one of the post-game press conferences, this team has had stretches where they've struggled to score the basketball. You mentioned some of the youth they have without Deuce Jones, their leading scorer, who left the team in conference play. Tell us how St. Joe's has kind of worked through some of those offensive struggles that they've had.
Sure. Well, the past couple of games in particular, it's been getting out on the fast break. I think really, if you look at the metrics from the conference tournament and the last couple of games in the NIT, and I mean, if you just watch the replay of last night's Cal game where, they were climbing back late in the second half, they've gotten out on transition with consistency. I mean, they have the guard play to do it. They have scorers like Jaden Glover Toscano, who's probably not the best 3-point shooter, but he gets downhill, with a high major athleticism. The guy was a St. John's recruit, as I mentioned earlier. And they turn defense into offense, sort of using that fast break transition. They get out on the floor quickly. And now I think the big question mark for me is, a Lobos team here that plays with a ton of pace as well. So I'm interested to see sort of how St. Joe's navigates that challenge. But in my head, I think this is going to come down to sort of the defensive end because, again, the St. Joe's offense has just been incredibly streaky throughout the year. But I mean, when they're scoring well, they've shown they can score with the best in the A10. If you sort of look at the conference stretch, I mean, a handful of games where they dropped 80, 90 plus points, even in overtime against Duquesne. And so, I touched on it earlier, but guys like Derek Simpson, Jaden Glover, Toscano, Desir Haskins, when threes are falling and when they're getting to the basket with efficiency, they can score with the best of them in the A10. Again, I think that's going to be a real challenge against the New Mexico team that certainly has some a very strong defensive unit of its own. And I know it's been a little shaky late. It was a little shaky late here in conference play, but coming off a game where they just held George Washington to 61, with Rafael Castro in the lineup, I could imagine this being a real challenge for St. Joe's too. But they play on the interior really well because, again, guys can get downhill with ease when they're not out in transition. Justice Ajabo has done a really good job stepping up at the rim and scoring it a little bit more efficiently this year. Obviously, he gets on the boards decently well, too. They're not afraid to play it with him. The three-point shooting can be very shaky at times. So a big question mark, for the St. Joe's team is whether the threes are falling or not. You look at the metrics and they're 325th in the country in adjusted three-point shooting efficiency. By the KenPom metrics, which we just had up. So not a team that shoots very efficiently from three. That's been a theme throughout the year. I know they were in the bottom three in three-point shooting really early in the year, and it's definitely steadily climbed a little bit, and they've had performances where they've shown they can knock down threes, just not super consistently. So it's a big question mark of which kind of St. Joe's team you're going to get. Is it going to be a grinded out defensive battle where they're just constantly looking to pick off some turnovers and try to get out in transition and maybe negate a little bit of New Mexico's pace, or is it going to be sort of a slog where they're not hitting a ton of threes and they're just looking to get back to the basket and feed it to Justice Ajabo and let maybe Jaden Glover Toscano get downhill or Derek Simpson attack the basket. On the other hand, if they're knocking down some threes, this is a St. Joe's team that, again, can score it really efficiently when they're playing, sort of at that highest level.
I have a question, Riley, regarding the guard play, because it's no secret to us who follow the Lobos pretty closely, but they've struggled with kind of more of the elusive guards that work really well in the pick and roll that can kind of create their own shot. Can you describe Derek Simpson's game a little bit? Is he more of like a creator, distributor type point guard? Is he more of a score first? Because he's averaging just under 14 points a game, but he's also averaging just under 6 assists a game too. And he seems like he's one of the more high usage type players. Is this someone that, obviously the Lobos have to key on?
Yeah, so it's a great question because when I think back to coming into this season, he definitely in my mind was sort of set to slot into that playmaking role. And he is definitely the lead playmaker on this St. Joe's team, but he's added a real scoring element to his game this year that, we didn't necessarily see coming into last year. He's done it with efficiency. You look at his player efficiency rating, I'm pretty sure he's in the 86th percentile in the country. There's been times where he's scoring close to 30 points per game. He had his first triple-double of his career this year. So he's really taken a huge step forward this year. And just in terms of his all-around game, he's really stepped into a leadership role too. He's kind of the guy who commands the press conferences when we're getting media with the players. I wouldn't necessarily say a lot of the questions are directed toward him, but I think a lot of the guys just rely on him for answers as one of the veteran guys in the locker room coming with some high major experience. And again, he's really, really improved this year, just in terms of his all-around game. He's not the most efficient scorer. You look at some of those three-point metrics and some of his overall shooting metrics, and not the most efficient player in the country, but he does get to the line a good bit. He shoots it very well at the line. I think he's about 91% at the free throw line. So definitely something, this St. Joe's team, as I mentioned, they get downhill very well. So definitely something to keep an eye on with him. He's not necessarily a guy who's going to go out and create, his own shots. St. Joe's runs a lot of ball screens for him. They try to get him and Jaden Glover Toscano, again, going downhill to the basket, rolling with guys like Justice Ajabo. They've played Jaden Smith a little bit more during this NIT sort of conference tournament stretch. And he had a very good game against Cal last night, getting to the basket, as well as getting some big rebounds and a big game on the defensive end too. So sort of the combination of he's always been a very solid playmaker, but this year he's definitely expanded his scoring game. I don't necessarily see him as a guy who's going to go out there and get his own shot, who's creating a lot for himself, who's, hitting step back threes and knocking them down with efficiency. But he can, when he's playing really well, he gets to the basket as well as anyone in the conference. There was definitely a point this year where people sort of pegged him as a potential A10 player of the year candidate, sort of just because maybe behind Robbie Avila of St. Louis, who I'm sure we're all familiar with, there was definitely sort of a lack of candidates this year. So he's got a very interesting game. He's a great two-way player. Most of the guys on this St. Joe's team are very strong on the defensive end. I definitely think of him more as a playmaker, but he's definitely evolved his offensive game. He can be a decent three-point shooter at times. I touched on it before, but this St. Joe's team is just so streaky from three. It's hard to call anyone really an incredible three-point shooter. But he gets downhill with efficiency. He's a great downhill scorer. He's great off the ball screen. And he's a great playmaker too, which, as I touched on, he's really been for the past couple of years of his career.
I got one more, and then I'm going to pass it back over to Nick. But, I mean, from just how you described his style of play, from what it sounds like from an outsider like me looking in, it's more of a Glover Toscano is the type of player that kind of stirs the drink for St. Joseph's. And he's a transfer in. He played at St. John's last year, just didn't see a ton of minutes. He's a New Jersey kid. What's the story there? And, I mean, he's leading the team, 16 points a game. High usage, but you said that once he kind of gets downhill, creates that's the guy that's going to kind of propel St. Joseph's forward.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with his story because he does have an interesting one. So this sort of all goes back to the head coaching change that sort of happened right before the season for St. Joe's. So Glover Toscano, a former 3-star recruit, sort of depending on which outlet you refer to and whatnot. I think at maybe one point he was a 4-star recruit, but he had been offered by St. Joe's out of high school. Had a good connection with our previous head coach, Coach Billy Lang, who was the one who departed right before the season. And so Coach Lang had actually pretty much built this roster for the season, had recruited, done a lot of the transfer portal recruiting. And so having maintained that connection with Glover Toscano, managed to sort of coup him back to St. Joe's after his freshman year at St. John's. And, Coach Lang ends up sort of leaving so close to the season that it's sort of too late for guys to go back to transfer in. So a lot of them sort of rallied around it and decided to stay. Rallied around Coach Donahue and decided to stay. But Glover Toscano sort of coming back to the school and deciding to stay because of them offering him out of high school and that connection he had made with the previous staff. I think worth mentioning in that aspect, a lot of sort of the assistants on staff are the same as they were under our previous head coach Billy Lang. So still a lot of connections on staff, and so that's sort of how he makes his way from St. John's down to Philly to St. Joe's. And yes, to your point, Eric, definitely more of that, scoring threat who's willing to take on sort of the brunt of it himself, can create his own shot, is probably one of our better 3-point shooters. Although, again, this team is so streaky and he can certainly be a big part of it. But I think his 36% on, one of the more marginal attempt rates on the team, would probably suggest he's one of the better 3-point shooters. But yes, again, a guy who gets downhill, he's got pretty good size for sort of I wouldn't quite call him a wing because you probably have to defend him with one of your guards. But he gets downhill. He uses his size very well, the way he attacks the basket. He can work for himself off the dribble, but again, we have some solid big men. So sort of everyone is not afraid to work off the ball screen and sort of help create for each other. I can't really speak to so much his freshman year at St. John's because he didn't play a lot, but a guy who came out of high school with a ton of pedigree. And so I don't think it was a huge surprise the way he stepped up for St. Joe's, but it's sort of the way it's taken over in the second half of the season. I think outside of he had a 23-point game to open the season against a Lafayette team, sort of a low major program at home. And then outside of that, he was pretty streaky for the most part, early in conference play. And just really late in the season, I mean, has picked it up extremely. And we've seen multiple 20-point performances. He was really strong in the conference tournament, dropped 24 against Cal last night. And, if we want to get into that game, I'm not sure, but he technically had the game-winning block in the final seconds as well. So again, a really strong two-way player, as I said, most of the guys on the St. Joe's team are. But yes, I don't want to say he's the opposite of Derek Simpson, but much more of a self-shot creator. A guy who can work off the dribble is a more of a knockdown 3-point shooter, but he gets downhill with a similar intensity. He gets to the basket well. He's quick off the dribble and can beat defenders, but has a little bit of size. So he's not afraid to work in the interior. And, again, we have a lot of size in the interior, so he sort of works off some of the big men well.
UNM men's basketball takes on St. Joseph's tomorrow night in the Pit in the quarterfinal round of the NIT. We're speaking with Riley Frayne of Mid-Major Madness. Riley, wanted to ask you about the turnaround, man. You mentioned the Cal game. We told our viewers a little bit about it this morning in a recap podcast, but man, I mean, St. Joe's is down 19 points in the second half with about 15 and a half minutes left. They complete the comeback. Tell us what happened, man.
It was crazy. So funny enough, I am watching the game and the clock just keeps ticking. So I should preface it by saying I was covering the NCAA tournament in Philadelphia yesterday, the UConn UCLA game and the Virginia Tennessee game before that. And so I was sort of just keeping an eye on the stat broadcast on my laptop as I was covering some of the other games. And, they sort of go down big early and I'm maybe checking it a little infrequently. And I sort of tune back in the second half and they're starting to pull it back. So I'm checking back in. And for the final 4 minutes, it was like nobody scored. And I'll get into a little bit more in a little bit. But when you're watching from the stat broadcast, sometimes it's a little tough to figure out what's going on. And so I could not for the life of me figure out what was going on. And thankfully, St. Joe's went down and took the lead late. Ended up nobody scoring again for the final 2 minutes of that game. So I just for a while sort of thought the stat broadcast was glitching, but sort of to explain it to fans. I mean, when I went back and watched the replay, it was interesting because having known what was going to happen in the game, that St. Joe's was going to come back from 19 down. You're watching the game and they're down double digits really with like 7 minutes left. And I just keep thinking to myself, like, when is this comeback going to happen? When is this comeback going to happen? Again, knowing sort of how the game was going to play out. 7 minutes left. They are still down. I believe it was 12 or 13. And I think it was Jaden Glover-Toscano throws away a turnover and Cal gets out on the fast break. And I literally just thought to myself, like, no way they actually came back in this game. Like, this is crazy. We're under the 7 minute mark, under the U8 timeout, and they are still down 13 points and Cal is about to score. And that was sort of when it all changed from that point on. They ended up actually stopping Cal in that possession. They went down the other floor and hit a big three, I think to cut it to 10 or 11. And sort of built the momentum from there on the defensive end. They had a couple of huge stops. They held Cal to literally 3 points in the final 4 minutes to sort of propel themselves in front. And then what it came down to in the final 2 minutes was crazy. St. Joe's pulled ahead on a Derek Simpson ball screen three, which a little bit, as I touched on, is sort of a little unique to his game and is sort of something the St. Joe's fans have touched on social media. They were excited to see. So he hits the off-ball screen here we go for the last 4 minutes. If you'd like me to slow down a little bit, let me know. But yeah, so St. Joe's, the last 4 minutes, nobody really scored. In particular, Cal only scored 3 points, I think, in the final 4 minutes. St. Joe is able to pull in front late, again, off that Derek Simpson ball screen three, as I'm sure we'll get to in a minute here. And then nobody really scored in the final. I think it's 2 minutes and like 2 seconds. It came down to a couple of big defensive stops, which was really what caught my attention in the last couple of seconds was, I've touched on St. Joe's defense here, so no surprise that they sort of made a couple big defensive stands. But the way they stepped up and sort of Cal, having allowed St. Joe's I believe on a 17-2 run in this late portion of the second half here to pull off this comeback, they put up a couple tough defensive stands too after sort of struggling on that end for a couple minutes. And it came down to sort of rock fight here in the end. We'll watch them close it out here in a second. But Jaden Glover-Toscano comes up with the big block in the waning seconds on the turnover here to get St. Joe's the win. And so, again, St. Joe's a really stout defensive team, and that's sort of what it came down to on the back end of the 19-point comeback. But yeah, you don't see comebacks like that every day. So it was certainly incredibly impressive, again, for a team that's a little bit young and inexperienced and is probably still learning how to win. Getting it done on the road all the way out on the West Coast in particular at the back end of a long season was really impressive. And again, it came down to defense. I'd imagine that's what it's going to come down to for St. Joe's tomorrow. That's sort of been the hallmark of the whole season. So, watching Jaden Glover-Toscano get that block and at the end, it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was a big surprise. It was definitely a really clean block too.
Yeah, man, let's talk about the matchup a little bit. Short turnaround for both these teams. It's less than 48 hours. St. Joe's, I imagine, has probably been out west maybe since last week when the tournament started. And I'll tell you this, man, UNM really does take advantage of the altitude here in Albuquerque.
I could imagine.
I'm sure you've heard about the Pit. We've got a famous arena, as Pit fans would say. It's packed. People love their basketball here. We're very passionate. They're into the game. But just UNM's style of play, they're top 50, top 52 in adjusted tempo in the KenPom. And anytime they get a turnover or a live ball steal, if they get a defensive rebound and they can push out in transition with numbers, they're going to push the ball, man. How do you think St. Joe's matches up against a style like that?
Yeah, I'm interested. I think there's going to be some good back and forth in terms of the tempo because, like I said, St. Joe's does like to use their defense to sort of create offense and get out on the fast break and create good downhill looks for Simpson and Glover Toscano and even Haskins getting his back to the basket a little bit occasionally. So I don't know if I like the matchup, but I'm definitely very interested to see how St. Joe's defense handles the tempo because our big men are certainly, I mean, they're capable in the front court, but they're shot swatters. They're not like get out and run guys who are going to go back and forth up and down the floor and still be able to do what they do on the interior. I'd be lying if I said I watched a whole ton of New Mexico this year. I've probably only seen them one or twice. I'm a big fan of Dayton Albury's game. I loved him at Queens in particular. But I don't necessarily know what New Mexico looks like in the front court. So I think that'll be an interesting matchup. Maybe one that St. Joe's could take advantage of. Again, Justice Ajabor, our big man, was co-defensive player of the year in the conference. But you asked specifically about the tempo, and I think that's going to be a big challenge for St. Joe's. They certainly can keep up with it. 136 in the country in adjusted tempo. Certainly no slouch in sort of this era of college basketball. But I think we have the guards to do it. We can get a little thin on the bench at times, but I look at guys like Kafik Meyer, who is one of the scrappiest players in the country and in the A10. I don't know about in the country necessarily, but
Sure.
A guy who's going to want to guard your best guard, who's going to get up and down with just about anyone, who's not afraid to do the dirty work for St. Joe's in the backcourt. And I think he's a guy who's going to be up for the challenge. I look at another freshman like Austin Wilford, son of an assistant coach at Georgetown, who's always up for sort of the defensive challenge, and a guy who gets out in tempo well, can hit a knockdown shot, isn't afraid to help space the floor or get downhill too, because he uses his size well at 6'4", 6'5" for a freshman. So I think we have defensive guys that are up for the challenge. I think we have the guards to run with it too. We can play with a little bit of tempo. But again, I mean, this is a New Mexico team that I think is still going to be a major challenge. You mentioned it, 42nd adjusted defensive efficiency, top 60 in offensive adjusted efficiency. So a two-way monster of a team. They certainly have. You guys certainly have. Some impressive guards. I know that there's some size in the front court too. I'd love to hear more about it from you guys, but I'd imagine, I think St. Joe's has the ability to keep up with the tempo, but I'd imagine just the overall size and the speed and is going to be a little bit of a challenge, particularly having been out on the West Coast so long. And, this having been, I could imagine a long stretch of a couple weeks for this team.
For sure, man. Yeah, UNM has been playing really good basketball since the NIT started. Strong win against Sam Houston, put up 107 points in the pit. They put up 86 against George Washington, and had they not shot so bad from three in the first half, they probably would have hit 100 again. So this team is playing downhill really well, man. We got some weapons on offense, just a couple of guys for your viewers or for the people that tune in. Uriah Tennette has been started at point guard. He's a freshman. One of our commenters just brought up Myers versus Uriah, battle of the freshman guards under 6 feet. Tennette has had the last 5 games. He's had 29 assists and only 2 turnovers. And so he's making really good decisions with the basketball. He's very explosive. Then you got Jake Hall, the Mountain West freshman of the year, set a school record. How many threes did he have last game? I think he had 4. So he's got 113 made 3-pointers on the season. But a 3-level scorer, man. He's not just a 3-point shooter, can hit the mid-range, put the ball on the floor. And then our big man, Tomislav Buljan, 6'10", Croatian. He played professional basketball in Croatia, but just a double-double machine. I think he's had 16 double-doubles on the season. So, man, a lot of weapons for UNM. I think it should be a good matchup, man. Why don't you tell us kind of your prediction? Ken Pom has this game 80-68 Lobos. Lobos are 10.5-point favorites. You think St. Joe's comes in to the pit, gets the win, and advances, or do you think the Lobos advance?
I hope none of my followers are watching. I think I've got to ride with New Mexico on this one. I think it's a tough challenge coming into the pit. I mean, for anyone, let alone a young team on the back end of a tiring road trip, I'm sure. I could only imagine. Our bench is a little bit thin. Our offense has not been great lately. I guess it wouldn't be a massive surprise if New Mexico ran away with it. But I think for my prediction, I'll keep it relatively close. I say New Mexico puts up 85 and maybe St. Joe's 78. So I'll put it a little bit closer than maybe the metrics are suggesting, just to give myself a little bit of hope, I suppose. But nonetheless, I'm hoping for a fun matchup, up tempo. I think it'll be a little bit of a rock fight at different points, but hopefully St. Joe's is hitting some threes, and that'll get up to my projected metrics. But at the very least, I think New Mexico will have a fun offensive game. And I'm excited to see how St. Joe's handles the pit. I certainly have only seen it on TV, so I don't get to see it too often. So it's always a treat when I do get to check out the environment and hear it, on the broadcast every once in a while. And I've certainly seen the social media clips that go viral. I know they do. I think literally the other day, the clips of sort of the cell phone flashlight intros were going all over my timeline and stuff like that. So excited to see how this team handles it. It'll be a good challenge for a young team, that's continuing to build. I know nothing's, promised in this transfer portal era in terms of player retention and everything like that, but just a growing opportunity, always exciting, and postseason basketball. So, you can never turn down playing a little bit more basketball, in my opinion, as a mid-major fan for sure.
Riley, we appreciate you joining us, man, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on East Coast time. Tell our followers where they can find you.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. It was really cool to see you guys reaching out and to have found some of my work all the way out there in New Mexico on the West Coast. I look forward to following along on your show. So thank you again for having me. Yeah, for those listening, you can check me out on Twitter. It says it on the screen here, but it's at Riley Frain, RILEYFRAIN. I'm a reporter for Mid-Major Madness. We do a lot of, mid-major centric men's and women's college basketball coverage. My coverage personally is a little more East Coast focused, but we do stuff all across the country. I've written stories on programs everywhere, including teams in the Mountain West. And, we have a lot of transfer portal centric stuff too coming up. So, just if you're a fan of college basketball and anything like that, definitely come check it out. We're doing NCAA tournament stuff, and I'm hoping to maybe be at the NIT semifinal doing some coverage there too, final NIT Final Four in Indianapolis doing some coverage there too. So definitely come check it out if you get a chance. And thank you, Nick and Eric, again for having me. Really appreciate it, guys.
Of course, man. We've been joined by Riley Frain of Mid-Major Madness. We've been previewing UNM men's basketball's quarterfinal matchup against St. Joe's tomorrow. You've been watching the Pit Press Live. We're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be back with former UNM women's basketball assistant coach Nikki Labato. Once again, this is the Pit Press Live.
Not just a day or a week. This President's Day event lasts all month long at Capitol Ford in Santa Fe. Find monumental savings on our best Ford selection, like a new 2026 Ford Escape plug-in hybrid, now $5,800 off MSRP. Or a new 2025 Ford Bronco Sport, just $400 a month lease for 36 months. So hurry and save during this President's Day event all month long at Capitol Ford in Santa Fe.
Welcome back to the Pit Press Live. We were joined by Riley Frain of Mid-Major Madness, previewing UNM men's basketball's quarterfinal matchup in the NIT versus St. Joe's. We're going to shift gears and talk a little UNM women's basketball. We're joined by former UNM women's basketball assistant coach Nikki Labato and Ed Nunez, the voice of Western New Mexico athletics. Dad, I'm going to let you take this one away.
Nick, thanks so much for joining us. I called you, it was about an hour ago, and you were kind enough to come on and join us and talk some Lovell women's hoops. So we really appreciate having you on. Nick, can you hear me, Nick?
Yeah.
She's a little bit frozen, Nick. I don't know if she can hear us or not.
Yeah. Maybe we can see if it came through there. Can you hear us, Nikki?
I got it.
Nikki,
Can you guys
hear
hear
us
me?
now? Yeah, we can hear you now. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can't hear you.
Okay, we can hear her, son. I don't know if you want her to.
Yeah,
back
maybe I
on?
can maybe see if Eric can help us out and put her backstage, and maybe Dad, you can try to get a hold of her and see if we can bring her back on. Yeah, it looks like Eric's still with us. We lost former assistant coach Nikki Lobato for UNM women's basketball. Dad, why don't you tell us a little bit about Coach Lobato, and we'll see if we can get her back on.
Okay, well, just some content. We're going to have Ken Sickinger on today. And one of our listeners or viewers. There's Nick now. Can you hear us now, Nick?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great.
Perfect. Yep.
So, Nikki, we're just giving you a little bit of background here. I asked you to come on about an hour ago, and I caught you right when you were working out, man. So, you and I have been friends a long time, man. So I really appreciate you coming on. And, we need a female perspective about Lobel women's basketball. But I want to give everybody a little bit of a background with you. You played at Sandia High School under a very good friend of mine and my son, Ed Wyants. You played there, and then you played at the University of New Mexico and coached for Coach Don Flanagan. I went back and looked at some of the records when Coach Flanagan was there. 14 straight winning seasons. He won 20 games 11 times at a time when UNM women's basketball was at its peak. And I know you remember when Mo Eckroth was here before, the program was struggling. And when Coach Flanagan came from El Dorado, he turned that thing around. Tell us a little bit about what it was like to play there and coach there, because at the time, New Mexico was drawing 15,000 fans for Lobel women's basketball. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, I think it was instantaneous. I mean, Coach Flanagan took over the program while I was still in high school. I think I was a junior at the time. And he turned New Mexico basketball around just like he did at El Dorado. He's able to coach players up and bring full potential out of them. And that's what I would say to this day is he knew exactly what he needed his assistants to bring in as far as the talent he needed. And then he just wanted to coach. Like, that is it. He wanted to do the X and O's and bring the best out of his players in regards to fundamentals and competition and energy. And he was just so easy to play for. I can tell you to this day, there are lifelong skills that I've learned from Coach Flanagan, with the positivity, the visualization, all these things that you can use in a day-to-day. And he truly, looking back, is one of the most influential coaches that I got to play for. But I know if you talk to anybody that played for him, they feel the exact same way. And it's amazing. It's a different era of basketball now, but the pit was rocking at the time. And he brought local players. He brought the talent that existed here and made sure to get them on the pit floor. And it grew. And he allowed his fans to really get to know the players. The fans were ingrained in the program just as much as he was. And so the community was really at its most interest in women's basketball during the time that Coach Flanagan was there.
It's kind of funny, Nick. I got to tell you a funny story. When I was still when I was officiating, and Coach Flanagan was at the El Dorado still. And Ben Wolf, who was coaching, Ben's a very good friend of mine, but Ben was coaching at Los Lunas at that time, girls. So he comes up to me before the game and he says, well, how are you guys going to call this game? Because I noticed the papers, the El Dorado only has 8 fouls. And I'm thinking to myself, how in the heck can I tell them how this game's going to be? And I love Ben. Benny's still a good friend, man. But I'm like, how in the heck can I tell you how this game's going to be called when it hasn't started? And number 2 was the fundamentals you mentioned. I see Katie Kern setting screens like this. You mentioned fundamentals, and I don't know that there was ever a better fundamental coach. How many titles did he win at El Dorado? People forgot that. He won numerous titles. I remember if he didn't like a call, I still remember, geez. I still remember hearing him say that. Geez. He would let you know if he didn't like a call. I remember that. But he was an excellent coach. And look at I went back and I was amazed. I'd forgotten the records, that he won 20 games 11 times and 14 straight winning seasons. Nick, I gotta ask you this. You did, and by the way, we didn't mention this, Nikki. I've known you a long time. You did games as a color commentator with Joe Barron. You did games with Josh Sushan. You did games with JJ Buck. You did some TV games this year with Josh Sushan again. I've heard you. I'd wanted to grab you for some games myself, but you're also an assistant coach at La Cueva with your daughter Peyton. She averaged 10 points a game this year. La Cueva losing in the quarterfinals against to the eventual state champions, the Hobbs Eagles. Tell us a little bit about La Cueva's season before we get back into UNM ball. Tell us a little bit about La Cueva's season this year and your daughter's development. She'll be a junior next year.
She will, absolutely. No, the girls this year, here's the thing with New Mexico basketball. You deal with each team, you have 2 to 3 maybe true basketball players at the high school level, and it's about surrounding cast and what can you do to develop those players. And that's what we did with La Cueva this year. There were just, you had Jordan Dyer, you had Peyton Lobato, you had Paz Romero. That was kind of the glue that existed, and you built around that. And I think they started out, they just weren't clicking chemistry-wise from the beginning. And that's really, as a coach, you got to work on it. And we continue to do that as a coaching staff. And at the end, all cylinders were firing. I think we played Hobbs the closest game and during the entire state tournament. La Cueva played them close. We had them right there to the end. Very good team, very physical team, ready to play. And we hit them at a time where they hit some shots down the stretch. We did not. But that's basketball for you. And I will tell you about my daughter, summer is the biggest thing. I mean, obviously high school hoops is for fun. You're trying to get that state title, but she's going to be playing all summer. She's, got a lot of aspirations. She's a lot better player than I ever was, just because they play year round. It's the intensity of basketball at the women's level is just so different nowadays. And she's doing phenomenal. She's a better shooter than I was, better ball handler than I was. So I'm envious of her and her work ethic right now. So that's exciting for her future.
Also helped out by being around the game with you when she was young, and you've got a lot of coaching experience, and you've got a great staff over there with Marissa Kogan. I did a couple of I broadcast a couple of games this year. Had a lot of fun doing that. Son, go ahead.
Yeah, Coach, I'll echo that. I saw you guys. I think it was your first game of the season against West Mesa, and I know you guys played well down the stretch in district. So congratulations to your daughter and the season that you guys had. Coach, wanted to ask you a little bit about UNM women's basketball. Obviously, some news announced this weekend that head coach Mike Bradbury and UNM had agreed to a contract buyout. So UNM women's basketball will have a new coach next year. You did some color commentary on a lot of Coach Bradbury games. And this program accomplished some things under him. I mean, we have to count that as well. That he won over 200 games here, had a regular season conference championship in 2021. Just kind of your thoughts on the Mike Bradbury era for UNM women's basketball.
Well, let me tell you, I mean, Mike Bradbury, X's and O's, and you can talk to any of the Mountain West coaches. They're going to tell you Mike had talent every year. He was able to coach them up. He developed players like that came in from freshmen, had them buy in and did well. I would say, he brought in a different style of basketball that UNM fans hadn't been used to. They played faster. They played more 3-ball. They had big De La Cerda, big-time 3-point shooter. He was really able to bring in his 3-point shooters and really try to bring the point average up. And so he did that with his program, and they did very, very well. I mean, always in regular season, top 3 or 4 of the Mountain West. Where Mike's team struggled, and he knows it, is down the stretch in the postseason. When he got to Vegas, his girls struggled to finish in Vegas. And as sometimes, Coach, you look at Coach Sanchez's era when she was there, she struggled during the regular season, but then she got him to Vegas and a different team showed up. And so, I will tell you, it's just different coaches dealing with players in different eras now that you're able to bring in that cast that's going to perform for you in Vegas in the Mountain West tournament and continue on to postseason play. And that's where I think the struggle was there. But I tell you, Mike had the cast of coaches that really believed in his program. And now you're dealing with a different business of players coming in that are getting paid and hard to keep players year to year. And these coaches are working within that transfer portal, which makes the job of a head coach extremely, extremely difficult.
That's true.
Yeah, Coach. Tell us what, your thoughts looking ahead for UNM women's basketball.
Yeah.
You talked about kind of the landscape, and you see that now with UNM women's basketball too. I thought Coach Bradbury brought in some talent. Alyssa Hargrove, the lefty, good player. He brought in Clarissa Craig, the transfer from Cincinnati. Joanna Magaish from Portugal. I mean, this was a talented team that could have easily won that game against Boise State in the quarterfinal. They're in their semifinal. I think they would have played Air Force, who they just beat by 20. on senior night. So, man, it's just the breaks of the game. Sometimes it happens. But what do you think is next, Coach? The next chapter for UNM women's basketball? What does this team need to do to kind of get back to competing for conference championships and have some success?
Well, I think, you have to, Mike Bradbury's chapter closes and he brought a lot of great to the program. I think there's a lot of things going forward that fans could be excited for with bringing in a new coach. I think there needs to be a ton of just community involvement. Right now, women's college basketball is at its highest peak, and we're struggling in Albuquerque, and we need to improve that. And one way to do that is the outreach of the community. You see it on the guys' side. The potential is there. It just needs to be more buy-in for the community to get to know the players that exist at UNM. I know that can be difficult with players leaving year after year, but we did have a ton of returners this year, and you did see attendance go up a little bit. So those are the kinds of things where the head coach coming in has got to find a way to reach out to the community. We don't see little girls there to watch the collegiate level like we've seen in the past. That has got to be improved in the UNM's program to where young individuals are coming and supporting, whether it's little boys, little girls coming and supporting the New Mexico program, because if they come to watch some of the New Mexico players play, they're going to be surprised at some of the basketball that the women's program can bring. And so that community outreach needs to be there, reach out to the alumni, and it's got to be more of a buy-in with the culture that's got to be there for the community to want to be part of this program. And once you get the community, I mean, as you can see it, New Mexico is always the hardest critics on our coaches, but if you haven't bought into the players that you have there, they are fans for life. And you see that even with some of the men's leaving in the transfer portal, you still see New Mexico fans cheering on these players at other venues. So I would say that's an opportunity for this new coach coming in, that they have the ability to bring the pit back to rocking to where we have 10,000 at a game.
Coach, I couldn't agree more. And we mentioned again, you played at a time when it did rock. And, I mentioned Coach Wyant, who's still a very good friend of mine. Eddie's in New Jersey. And back in the day, I told you that he had the keys to the pit, and I would play. If you better have a gold-plated invitation to show up there, because if you didn't, oh man, my son would be up in the mezzanine when there's still the mezzanine playing up there. That's how far that memory goes back. And Hazel Toll-Leach was also an assistant there. I don't want to forget about her.
Right.
Love Hazel. Hazel is a very good friend and a good coach. So the surrounding staff that surrounded Coach Flanagan was certainly very, very good and contributed in a lot of different ways. You mentioned the atmosphere, the culture. And I got to ask you this. Coach Flanagan's old school, man. In fact, I saw Shane at the state tournament. I hadn't seen Shane in a while. His son, Shane, who used to play at El Dorado, dang good player. And I happened to talk to him for a little while. But how do you think Coach Flanagan would have adjusted to today's? You mentioned, Nick, about how the game is today. The coach comes in, the players are getting paid. It's a whole different atmosphere for Coach Olin. It was for Coach Bradbury. How do you think Coach Flanagan would have adjusted? Do you think he would have enjoyed today's? And you talk to him still. You still talk to him. What does he think about today's NIL and players getting paid and things like that?
I think there's some positive and negatives to it. I think he always found the good in everything. So I would tell you that he would make it work. But I will tell you the struggle he would have had is Coach Flanagan didn't like to fly. That's why. So, these Hawaiian tournaments where you're going overseas, that definitely would not be on a Coach Flanagan schedule. That would not be his thing. He would meet us, drive us. He would drive there and meet the team there just because he would try to avoid flights as much as possible. That would be a struggle for him. The fact that I think he loved the portion of being with 18 to 21-year-olds because he's molding you for life. And I feel like today's group, it's more of a business transaction. You're getting paid to be here. And so you've got to produce. And that's the players feel that and the coaches feel that. And so it's just a different environment to where, they're trying to be that head coaches today are trying to be that mentor, but they're also your boss right now in a way. And so it makes it a really hard job. And then you're dealing with the transfer portal that's taking away the high school player and saying, well, I don't really want a business transaction with an 18-year-old because I don't know what I'm going to get out of them. So I'm going to the transfer portal with some older kids where I know they've had some experience. I've seen them play at the D1 level, and they can morph them into the system that they need to. So I think Coach Flanagan would have had his struggles, but with all the greats, you've seen coaches that are still around today that have morphed. They have their struggles, but they're adopting. And one thing I will tell you with Coach Flanagan, he's been able to adopt over the years, and he still is always successful in everything he does. And so I would tell you, yes, he would have his struggles, but he'd figure out a way to make it work. Now, I would say one thing that Flanagan would do now, regardless of it, is he would really go after those local talents and try to make them the heroes of the town. The Bella Hines, Sydney Benally, those, he would have really gone after them to try to bring in the attendance, put them on the floor right away and build them, even if it's, losing some gains here and there, but he's gaining attendance and he's gaining community interaction. And those are the things that I think if with a new coach coming in, they've got to be able to morph in some of the young talent that exists in New Mexico to get some buy-in from the community.
Nick, you got to be excited about the possibilities. Now, again, all due respect to Coach Bradbury, and they had a chance to win against Boise State. I saw Nike McClure at the pit during the state tournament, and she said that, hey, Destiny had a great shot at the rim. They had a good Destiny hooks, had a good look at the rim. And like my son said, and Nick, this, sometimes it's the breaks of the game. It didn't work out, man, but they had the look that they wanted. They did, again, it just didn't go in. But I think there's got to be excitement. They had stability with Coach Flanagan, with Coach Yvonne Sanchez, who was here for a while, and now Coach Bradbury was here for 10 years. So one name that popped up, I asked you about her, was Lena Lovato, the associate head coach at Texas, who played here at Rio Grande for Dan Simmons back in the day. What do you know about her?
Hey, she's at Texas right now, and they're competing for an NCAA national title. And she's been mentored. She's had history of success in everywhere she's coached, and she was an incredible player. So I think that's, if UNM doesn't take a look at that, you really need to look at your options right now. UNM is a very highly enticable job on the women's side because they have the ability to build this. They're going to struggle with, they've got to continue to find NIL money to make sure that they can bring in the players that they want to. But I think Elena gives you that flavor of, she knows what it takes to be in the New Mexico side of things. She knows how to win. She's been a part of winning programs everywhere she's gone. And I'll take Coach Bradbury's and use it back. He recruits players that are on winning basketball teams because they have that competitive edge and they know how to win. That's what Elena Lovato would bring, and she's an incredible coach and was an incredible player, and I'm hoping New Mexico takes a look at them. But I know there's going to be a lot of good candidates that New Mexico is going to have the ability to go after, and I think this is a really critical time where the program could go in Mike's taking it here, and hopefully another coach can take it to another level.
Yeah, there's some excitement there. I would think, again, Coach Bradbury, wish him all the best. He did a wonderful job here. Nick, I've got to ask you, you played with Jordan Adams, Katie Kern, Molly McKinnon, Tamika Stukes, the late Miranda Sanchez, who was a great player, played with you at Sandia and then played at UNM. Tell us a little bit about some of the players that you played and coached at UNM while you were there.
Oh, God. Well, you just named a bunch of them. I mean, Miranda Sanchez, we played high school together. We roomed together my freshman and sophomore year. I was just always with individual players with Katie Kern. Katie Kern knew how to set a screen, how to use her. And Coach Flanagan used each of these players along the way and brought the best out of them and realized strengths and weaknesses of individual players and fed off of that. And so I will tell you, Miranda was incredible. Jordan Adams was an incredible player. Got to play with her. Katie Kern was incredible. Tamika Stukes, I will tell you, when you come into the college level, having to guard Tamika my freshman and sophomore years made me a better player for the future. So, your practice players can really make you better. Blessed with, Chelsea Greer, Jordan Adams, Katie Kern, Miranda Sanchez, myself, Jennifer Williams. There were so many good players that I got to play with, and I was so fortunate to be with those players 4 years and enjoy that process. It's a little bit different today. You got 1 to 2 years with certain players and they move on to the transfer portal, but you're seeing each program just find the value in the family that they can for the years that they have.
I think there's a lot of excitement coming up, Nick. We'll see what Ryan Berryman's first big hire here as the new athletic director. Nikki Lovato, we sure appreciate you joining us on the Pit Press, and we'll definitely get you back on in the future. Thanks again for pinch hitting for Ken Sickinger. We really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, I'm no Ken Sickinger, but you know what? I filled in the best I could. Thanks for having me on. And go Lobos. Good luck to the men this week.
Yeah, that's right. And tomorrow night against St. Joseph's, semifinal in the pit, and they win. They go to the semis in Indianapolis. So let's get behind Lobos, the Lobo men, tomorrow night at 7 p.m. in the pit. Once again, Nikki, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back with Eric Moulton. We'll recap the show, take a look at some comments. You're tuning into the Pit Press Live.
Not just a day or a week. This President's Day event lasts all month long at Capitol Ford in Santa Fe. Find monumental savings on our best Ford selection, like a new 2026 Ford Escape plug-in hybrid, now $5,800 off MSRP. Or a new 2025 Ford Bronco Sport, just $400 a month, lease for 36 months. So hurry and save during this President's Day event all month long at Capitol Ford in Santa Fe.
All right, welcome back to the Pit Press Live. We were joined by La Cueva girls assistant basketball coach Nikki Labato. We were talking UNM women's basketball. Joining us back from backstage is Eric Moulton. Eric, what were your thoughts on our chat with Coach Labato about UNM women's basketball?
Man, the first thought that came to mind was we need more female voices on the Pit Press. Someone that knows ball, someone that's been there, someone that has a history with UNM too, right? The stories with Coach Flanagan, and I mean, there's Lobo basketball runs deep both on the men's and the women's side. I think we need to do a better job of covering it. But no, I thoroughly enjoyed you guys' interview, her conversation. She's fully invested in women's basketball is just as strong as Lobo men's basketball is. So I'm glad you guys were able to get her on last minute.
For sure, Dad. Really appreciate you reaching out to Coach Labato. I know you reached out to Ken Sickinger of the Albuquerque Journal. He couldn't join us tonight, but Coach Labato, man, she's a true basketball mind. Thanks again for getting her, Dad.
No, it's kind of funny. Her name is she went by Nikki Heckroth back in the day, and her brother Brandon Heckroth played for Sandia, and her brother, man, played at Highlands. Her brother was a very good player. So when Coach Wyan would open up Sandia, Nick, before he came and went to UNM, I'd go at it with Brandon, man. Brandon could jump. Brandon was, a lot more athletic, but Brandon and I had some battles. So I've known Nikki for a long time, listened to her do games with Joe Barron, with Josh Shushan, and then with JJ Buck. She stepped back because her daughter Peyton is playing at La Cueva. So I've tried to get her on. I had her on 99.9 FM a couple years ago. Nick knows, you could tell. She's very passionate about women's basketball, about UNM. So I'm telling you, Eric and Nick, when Sick couldn't come on, I'm like, man. And then I was like, boom, bingo. Something came to my mind about Nikki. And so and Nikki was working out. She's like, I'm just about to work out. And I was like, Nick, man, could you pinch hit? We got to get her on more. And seeing Flanagan's record, 20 games, he won 20 games 11 times, 14 straight winning seasons. We got to get Flan on. We got to get him on, man. I mean, that guy was the architect of Lobo women's basketball. Yvonne Sanchez came in. I love Yvonne. She worked games with me, Nick. I don't know if you ever worked a game with her as a color commentator. She was awesome. And then Coach Bradbury was here 10 years. They've had stability at that position. So I think it's going to be a challenge for Ryan Berryman, his first big hire. Let's see who he brings in.
Let's get to some comments. This is from Steve Singletary, 2126. We're shifting gears and talking about UNM men's basketball. They will take on St. Joseph's tomorrow in the pit, 7 p.m. NIT quarterfinal. Lobos should win, but don't sleep on St. Joseph's. They erased a 19-point lead and beat Cal at home. Elevation and the power of the pit might be a huge factor tomorrow. We talked about that with Riley earlier, Eric. Short turnaround for both of these teams. St. Joe's having to play at elevation. I thought that did affect GW down the stretch of the second half. It affected Sam Houston a little bit. You got to think that's going to play a factor, Eric, on tomorrow.
Yeah, it is. And Riley did touch on it too, man. The overall depth of St. Joe's, they run about 7 guys deep, and they're really top heavy in their scoring, right? And this isn't a team that likes to get up and down and run, and that's exactly what UNM likes to do. And when you have to do that at elevation, you're on the road back to back games, having to play on a quick turnaround like that, it doesn't bode well for a St. Joseph's team. And then Riley also talked about St. Joe's offensive efficiency. They're just not a good offensive team. They haven't been. They're a bit streaky, and usually if you're trying to steal one on the road against a team that likes to push the pace a little bit, you got to convert buckets. And if they're not able to do that, and they're already running thin on their rotation, it's going to be tough to keep up. And Nick, you and I texted a little bit, kind of following up on that interview, but UNM style, man. If DA does come back, which I think they're anticipating, he is going to play tomorrow. You also get Uriah Tenet, Jake Hall. These guys like to play in transition, and they're taking shots early in the shot clock. They really like to push the pace. That's just the style they play with. It's almost like the complete opposite of what St. Joe's plays with. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's another route, like the same way that New Mexico blew out George Washington. But then again, this team's good, man. They finished third in the A10. They lost to VCU twice, but I think their only Q1 victory on the season was at Cal, which they did yesterday. So interesting matchup, but I just don't feel like St. Joe's can keep up with the pace.
UNM 10.5-point favorites tomorrow against St. Joseph's in the Pit. Let's go back to the comments. This is Raynard Ford, 641. Wish the Lobos played loose during the Mountain West Conference tournament. They're playing loose in the NIT games. They are playing at high level in the NIT. And, Dad, maybe we talked about this. Maybe the strength of your opponent isn't as high as it was in the Mountain West Conference tournament and down the stretch of the Mountain West Conference season. You look at a team like Sam Houston. I don't have their Ken Palm and their net in front of me. They won over 20 games, and they were second-place finishers in Conference USA. Then you got George Washington, 19-15 on the season, ninth-place finishers in the Atlantic 10 Conference. Both these teams fairly far behind UNM in both Ken Palm and in net. So maybe it's the strength of opponent, but also it does seem like the Lobos are playing a little bit looser.
Somebody mentioned that the disappointment of the Mountain West Conference tournament didn't carry over. Nick, you and I talked about that. How would they respond against Sam Houston? And they came out with energy. They came out against George Washington with the same kind of energy and efficiency on both ends of the floor. So I expect that tomorrow. We mentioned that having New Mexico at home is a huge advantage. Now, if there's flu symptoms with Albury, hopefully they got him hydrated today. And, he's going to be a step maybe behind, but that guy is a gamer. He's going to want to be out there and play, and I'm expecting him to play well tomorrow night. Tenet has been playing, 20 points and 15 points, 2 games with no turnovers, getting his spots, hitting shots, getting 2 feet in the paint. Eric Olin likes those paint touches, and New Mexico was just so efficient from 11 3-pointers last night in that big win. So I expect UNM's got a huge advantage playing at home. They really do.
Let's get back to the comments. This is from Ruben Valles, 917. The NIT Final Four being in Indy at the same time as the real Final Four is such a great idea and makes getting to the NIT Final Four super fun. And we talked to Coach Olin a little bit about this, about the exposure. What does UNM get out of being in the NIT? They're going to be on ESPN2 tomorrow, and I'm pretty sure the semifinal and championship rounds of the NIT will also be covered by an ESPN major network. Eric, Dad, let's pull up the NIT bracket, and this is from the NIT's X page. I'm going to share my screen here. It's kind of small print, but I'll read them out to you here. On the left side, the semifinal. Eric, you can correct me if I'm wrong if this is going to be played on Tuesday or Wednesday, but you got Auburn taking on Nevada. The Wolfpack will have to travel to Auburn. Then on the other side of the bracket, it's Dayton taking on Illinois State. The top half of the bracket, you got UNM taking on St. Joseph's. And then the Lobos, if they win, they'll get the winner of Tulsa and Wichita State. Eric, your thoughts on this NIT bracket, man? Do you like this for the Lobos?
I think it lines up well for the Lobos, man, especially with St. Joseph's knocking off Colorado State. I was a little suspect when I saw that they ended up on the same side of the bracket as Colorado State, because they came into the pit and knocked off a really good Lobo team. Pretty significantly in that last matchup here at the pit. But St. Joseph's knocked them off, and credit to them for doing that. But outside of that, I haven't really seen Tulsa or Wichita State play, so it's tough to say who they might meet up with in the Final Four if they were able to advance that far. But on the other side of the bracket with Nevada and Auburn, we've seen Nevada play. We know what they bring. We split with them over the course of the regular conference season. And Illinois State and Dayton. I mean, Dayton's just another strong A10 conference team. And I would say the A10 is pretty comparable to what you see out west with the Mountain West. There's a lot of good basketball that's played in that conference. I think the Mountain West might be a little bit deeper in terms of quality teams. But VCU being in that conference, right? And then you have Dayton, you have St. Joseph. So really good basketball all around. But I think it shapes up really well for the Lobos and could potentially meet up with Coach Alford in Nevada. I think they knock off Auburn. They find a way to win in that final in that quarterfinal game.
Back to the comments. This is Kylo Sanchez, 505. I'll be in Section R, row 20, the seat closest to Section S. Dad, attendance for tomorrow's game. Your prediction. The Lobos got in 7,286 against Sam Houston, 9,207 against George Washington. What do you think the Lobos get tomorrow in the quarterfinal?
They're shooting for 10, and I'll tell you what, I thought that 9,200 crowd made a lot of noise. Sounded like 12 to me. Your mom and I looked around. We thought, hey, and we thought there might have been 10. So tomorrow night, I'm going to say 10,500, hovering around 11. So I think people are excited. The section I was in, and I could be a fan last night. You Nick, you have to settle for me elbowing you every time the Lobos do something good, man. I hit you some pretty good shots too, man. You haven't really said anything, but So, but the Lobo fans that were around us last night, man, as enthusiastic as they want to see their Lobos win, continue to advance, and play again. So I'm going to call it 10,500. They'll get it, and hovering around 11. I'll call it there. That's my prediction.
Just to show you a little bit more love, Dad, Luis Torres, 1268. Ed at Chili's, cool guy. Would love to talk basketball with him. We appreciate that, Luis Torres. Appreciate everybody for tuning in. Guys, I'm going through the comments. Anything you guys want to chat about?
No, I thought you guys did a really good job of breaking down the game last night, staying up late, covering the game. But I just echo a lot of your guys' thoughts in regards to just how Uriah Tenet stepped up, played true point guard role, right? Saw more of a significant role. His composure as a true freshman, being able to run the offense, control the game. He really ran that pick and roll, was really effective, made a lot of quick, good decisions. His ability to get into the lane and just kind of find his spots on the floor and hit from the mid-range really changes the dynamic for his game, because we've seen him hit from the outside. Obviously, he's a real explosive player, can finish around the rim, but he's a tough guard, man, for anyone to figure out. And if he gets inside and kind of maneuvers and finds his spots on the floor, he's really a tough guy to lock down. And then when you have kind of surrounded by shooters like Jake Hall, Miller had a really good game yesterday too, was able to knock down some threes. And then finally seeing Tomeo Pons step up and get some minutes and had a nice dunk, had a three. I was actually texting our buddy Ricky Thompson last night, and I was like, man, I really wish that Tomeo would get some good quality minutes and actually start looking for some shots. And I think the next minute he checked in and knocked down that three right away. So it's just good to see these other guys kind of fill out the role. I think this team is deep. They run 8 guys out there when healthy. It's just nice to see them kind of come together late in the season and play as well as they have been.
Last couple comments here. This one's going to be from Albert Gabaldon. They need someone who's going to be proactive like Coach Eck, call out people to come out and support. And I think he's referring to our conversation with La Cueva girls basketball coach Nikki Labato about who's going to be the next UNM women's basketball coach. I kind of agree with that, Dad. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit more. Coach Bradbury, was he proactive out in the community, encouraging people to come to games? I'm not sure. I'm sure he was at certain times. Coach Yvonne Sanchez was from here. Plus, she came at the back end of the Flanagan era. I agree with that point. They're going to need somebody to sell the program.
You know what? Look, let's be honest. Not everybody's going to do that. Now, I don't mean that in a bad way. Coach Paul Weir. Paul Weir is a community guy. I still remember seeing him in the stands, going up to the student section, shaking hands. But it didn't work out for him, man. Rocky was they'd say if Rocky saw you at a restaurant, he'd talk your ear off, man, about Lobo football and buy you lunch maybe. But he wasn't the guy that's going to go out in the community. People went out to see him because he was, he played here for the Lobos, man. So, Bronco, that guy wasn't going to sell any. In fact, he closed practices, didn't want anybody in there. That he had his own style. Coach Eck, I've never seen anybody like him in years. He's out there in the community. You see him a lot. So, but Nikki made a great point about Coach Flanagan. And then, they had Hazel Leach, who had played here as well. Nikki Heckroth was at that time Heckroth, now Lobato, had played at Sandia. They had a lot of local flavor. She mentioned all the local players. But the community part, it would be nice. That's a bonus. You want a good coach first. Some people aren't Coach Olin isn't in the community a lot. He seems to be sometimes an introverted guy, but I like the guy. I've enjoyed doing press or being at the press conferences with him and asking him questions. So I think you want the best coach you can get, and hopefully and I think you both agree. Not everybody feels comfortable going and me, son. When you and I are together, sometimes you'll be like, okay, that's it. You can't talk to nobody else, man. So yeah, I'm comfortable talking to a whole lot of people. There's some people that aren't. You want the best coach you can get first, and hopefully a good community person that will get out there and sell the program second.
Eric, did you want to give a shout out to our sponsors?
Yeah, I do want to give a shout out. We appreciate all of our sponsors. Zach Brandt over at Capital Ford, been with us from the beginning. And Southwest Spray Foam, they're based out of Santa Fe. Really, they kind of came on with us late, but appreciate the work they do. We actually met up with them and his family in Vegas. Nick, you actually had a chance to meet up with them at that, what was it, the Tom's Bar, or it was like right off the strip. Tom's Watch Bar, yeah. So we met up with them there. So really want to give a shout out to them. Thanks for the support. We want to thank all of our viewers, our listeners, everyone that tunes in, everyone that reads what Nick writes and what everyone here contributes. We appreciate all of you guys.
Yeah, no doubt, man. Really appreciate it. Our two guests tonight were Riley Frayne of Mid-Major Madness. We previewed UNM men's basketball's matchup tomorrow against St. Joseph's. Then we were also joined by La Cueva girls basketball, or assistant girls basketball coach Nikki Lobato, talking about UNM women's basketball and what is next for the program. For Eric Moulton, the owner of the Pit Press, Ed Nunez, a Lobo fan since 1970. I'm Nick Nunez. Thank you for tuning in to the Pit Press Live.